My name is Mike Moyle, and I am the historian at the Sausalito Portuguese Cultural Center. On July 28, 2026, I gave a presentation for the Marin History Museum on the history of the Marin Dairymen's Milk Company, better known as Marin-Dell. I'm going to start with a little bit about how I got involved with dairy history in the first place, something about Marin's long dairy history, the history of Marin-Dell, the company itself, and then finally, the amazing Marin-Dell binders that have incredible information about some of the dairy families here in Marin and Sonoma. This is the Sausalito Portuguese Cultural Center that was established in 1888. This building on Caledonia Street was built in 1953. One of the first things I started to do when I became involved with the cultural center was the creation of a walking tour through Sausalito and the surrounding area that focused on some of the locations that had a particular involvement with our Portuguese heritage. A few of those locations at the very end, out in the Tennessee Valley and the Marin Headlands, were involved with dairies that had been operated there by Portuguese families, although I really didn't have any inkling as to exactly how many there were in Marin. Over time, I learned that there were many dairies that had been operated here in southern Marin by Portuguese families. And then I had the great fortune of meeting a fellow named Dewey Livingston, who has done a tremendous amount of work on the history of West Marin in particular, and focusing on the dairy operations there. Dewey, apart from being a wonderful person, is a prolific writer, and over the last 20 years, these are just some of the books that he has written. He has also been involved with oral history interviews. This was a set of interviews that Dewey was the prime interviewer for the Marin Resource Conservation District. These were some of the key dairy families operating in the West Marin area. Dewey has been honored for his work. In 2019. He received the Marin History Museum's annual Historian Award. And just this year, he and Eva Taylor were honored as Grand Marshal and Junior Grand Marshal at Point Reyes Station's Western Weekend. I wanted to note as well that Eva has a particularly spot in our hearts in Sausalito, since she was our queen at our Festa in 2015. She's also the daughter of Karen and John Taylor at the Bivalve Dairy along Tamales Bay, the great-granddaughter of Joe and Scotty Mendoza, who are shown in the picture there, and the great-great-granddaughter of Joseph and Zena Mendoza, who immigrated here from the Azores and purchased the A and B ranches on Point Reyes Peninsula in 1919. So Eva's roots go way back. With Dewey, we started a project that we called the Marin Dairy Project. This was an effort to identify every location in Marin County where a dairy had operated at some point in our history. And this map shows a partial group of those dairies. About 300 are shown here on this map. However, we've now gotten up to around 400 dairies that operated here in Marin over the years, and unfortunately only a few, I think around 13, are still in operation today. Marin's dairy history goes back to the 1850s when people began to produce butter and cheese primarily up on the Point Reyes Peninsula. Those products were then brought down by schooner from Point Reyes to San Francisco. The dairy industry grew over time. This is a photo showing some milking occurring at the Cunha Dairy in Tennessee Valley. Those milkers are all using the most modern technology, which is the one-legged milker's stool you can see in the insert there, which strapped on and allowed you to move from cow to cow more quickly. As you can see, though, the sanitary conditions were not the best. This is a photo showing milk distribution. This is at the Rosa Dairy, which was right at along Nevada Street here in Sausalito. And it looks like they're just heading out with some cans of milk, probably to deliver directly to some of the customers in the Sausalito area, who would probably just bring down a jar and have the milk filled directly from the pails. The big development for transportation in Marin was first the coming of the ferry in 1868 that ran between Sausalito and San Francisco, and then just a few years later in 1874, the opening of the rail service. This was the North Pacific Coast Railroad that ran from Sausalito ultimately all the way up to Sonoma County, where it connected with some lumbering operations that brought lumber down and then by ferry across the Golden Gate to San Francisco. You can see here on the map the references to dairy land, dairy and agricultural land. And the railroad certainly opened up the Marin and Sonoma to the opportunity to bring dairy products, including fresh milk, down to Sausalito and then across to San Francisco. This slide shows just some of the dairy operations here in Marin County and their evolution over time. You can see Marin-Dell was established in 1930. That's the red dotted line, but there were many dairy operations before that and operations other than Marin-Dell as well after that. In Marin and in San Rafael in particular, these were the big three dairy operations that produced milk for retail home delivery. Lucas Valley, which ultimately became Clover, Marin County Milk, which was acquired by Borden's, and Roberts, which was acquired by Golden State, later Foremost. I have done a presentation on the more general topic of dairies and milk distribution in Marin for the Marin History Museum, and that presentation is available on YouTube. So, the Marin Dairymen's Milk Company, Marin-Dell. It was incorporated in 1930 by a group of largely dairymen and some businessmen from San Francisco as well. These are some of the initial directors of the company, including a number of people we'll be touching on as we go forward. Thomas Bodkin was the husband of Julia Bodkin, who had been the wife of a gentleman named Pacheco, who owned some dairy land in Marin. He passed away, and she then married Thomas Bodkin. And so you'll see references to Julia Bodkin properties, particularly up around the Pacheco or the Ignacio and Novato areas. Anthony Silveira was a prominent Portuguese dairyman. Alfred Corda was a dairyman of Swiss descent, and the others as well. This is the management lineup 20 years later in 1950. At that point, Erskine McNear, Alfred Corda were the only two who were the original incorporators. All of the other directors and members of management were dairy operators or retired dairy operators. So 1930, here are a few initial considerations that the folks that got together to establish Marin-Dell would have had in mind. First of all, starting a business during the Depression must have been quite a leap of faith and obviously a substantial risk. The primary focus of Marin-Dell was the San Francisco market. And you can see with the Marin population of only 42,000 in 1930 versus the San Francisco population of several times that amount, why the San Francisco market was a more appealing prospect. Certainly, starting the company involved a substantial capital investment, both for the processing facility in San Francisco and trucks to transport the milk. The milk initially was all sourced in Marin. Sonoma expansion into Sonoma would start in 1932. And of course, transporting it to San Francisco versus ferry, via ferry, since the Golden Gate Bridge did not open until 1937, 7 years later. The Marin-Dell purchased milk only from so-called Grade A dairies. There was a distinction between Grade A dairies and Grade B dairies. Was a regulation based on sanitary considerations. Only Grade A dairies, which had more enhanced sanitation, including the cement floors in the barns and so forth, could sell fluid milk to be used for direct consumption. Grade B dairies, their milk had to go to things like cheese and butter production. And then finally, Marin-Dell decided that it would sell only at wholesale through independent markets, and that remained a key focus of their business plan. The Marin-Dell plant, the production plant, was established at 1675 Harrison Street in San Francisco in 1930. This turned out to be just a couple of blocks away from Seals Stadium, which is shown on the photo, which opened in 1931. Marin-Dell had a fleet of trucks, both to pick up raw milk at delivery points in Marin, and then also to deliver the bottled milk to its independent grocer customers. In 1939, a brand new plant was opened at the same location. And this is a photo showing the new plant. Here are some of the equipment inside the plant. And happily, that building still stands today, although a very different use that it's being put to. It is the home of BMW of San Francisco. Marin-Dell also made some acquisitions along the way, most notably a set of companies operations called Dairy-Made Creameries down in the valley, which it acquired in the 1940s. We don't really know that much about the financial performance of Marin-Dell. It was obviously successful. This was some information I found from an article on a 1935 lawsuit that was demanding a dividend payment to be made. The plaintiff, or one of the plaintiffs in the suit, was Mr. Bodkin. You may recall was the original president. It seemed that things had gone a bit south in terms of the internal relationships in the company, since he was suing some of the other directors. The allegations were the things that I was most interested in terms of financial performance. Now, of course, these are the plaintiff's allegations, but he claimed that the corporation was earning $7,000 a month in profit, had a net worth of $230,000, and a stock value of $140 a share, which, if those were even close to correct, would mean it was doing pretty well. So the producers, the individual dairies, operators would have to fill up their milk cans with the milk at their dairies, and then they would transport those to delivery points or depots that were established by Marin-Dell. This is one of the depots that's shown in the photo there. The Marin-Dell trucks would then come to those depots and pick up the full cans of milk and then leave empty cans that the dairy operators would then pick up later. Every can was marked with a producer number, and you can see number 32 on the cans at the upper left. That was the number for one of their suppliers named Henry Nels. This was an interesting story that appeared in the Marin-Dell binders. One of the early suppliers was a dairy operated by a fellow named Gus Lures that was way up in Santa Rosa. In 1932, when Gus was trying to sell his milk, Marin-Dell was the only company that he could find that would buy it. But it told him that if they were going to buy it, at that point, the delivery pickup point that they had that was furthest north was at the Highway 101 Route 37 interchange. And so Gus agreed, but for several years, he then had to bring his milk down all the way to that pickup point twice daily. And so that was just a way of showing how desperate some of these dairy farmers were at that time. Over time, Marin-Dell began using tanker trucks that would come directly to the individual dairies, where they would be collecting the milk in large stainless steel tanks that they could then make the transfer directly from the tanks to the trucks. The early days, the 1930s for Marin-Dell, was a period of some volatility. The company faced competition, and as you can see from the ads on the left, it was sort of viewed as the little guy fighting against the big guy on Wall Street in its efforts to be successful. On the other hand, it was a period of a lot of labor unrest too, and for a period of 3 or 4 years there in the mid-30s, there are constant labor disputes with the milk companies. These included both Marin-Dell, which was ultimately unionized in San Francisco, but also with the suppliers to the company that were themselves the subjects of union targeting. And as you can see, at some point there was even the need for armed law enforcement to escort the trucks that were coming into the city to deliver milk. Marin-Dell was very active with advertising. These were some of the posters you can see on the left. It also advertised on the radio. It had sponsored a program called The Musical Milkman. Their most successful radio sponsorship, though, was for something called the Marin-Dell Amateur Hour that was hosted by a gentleman named Dean Maddox, who went by the nickname of Buddha. He had a 21-year run on the radio under Marin-Dell's sponsorship with over 1,000 broadcasts, and he boasted that there were over 800 individuals who had appeared on his amateur hour who went on to find jobs in the film and the musical business. Anyway, the advertising was successful. In 1935, Marin-Dell had achieved a 28% share in the San Francisco market. Here's another advertising poster, and that utilized one of the Marin-Dell executives, a gentleman named Arnold Spinetti, on the Casey at Bat theme. So in 1953, Marin-Dell was acquired by Foremost Dairies. This was, I think, their first major acquisition here in California. They would go on to acquire other companies as well. But even though Marin-Dell was acquired, it continued to operate as a independent subsidiary of Foremost at least until the 1960s. And so you can continue to see Marin-Dell branding on products that were being sold. The main thing, though, in terms of what led me to this project and what I'd like to talk about today are what I've called the Marin-Dell binders. Around 1950, the company decided that it was going to create a really set of oral histories for every one of the dairy operators that were supplying milk to the company at that time, and there were in fact 62 different dairies. I've noted there 59, which is missing, and so the actual number is 62. We're very appreciative of the Judith Ross, Janet Sosa, and Kevin Silvera, siblings who donated the Marin-Dell binders to the Novato Historical Guild in memory of their grandfather, Tony Silvera, who passed away and also their parents, George and Alice Silvera, their uncle and aunt, Joseph and Mary Silvera. Their grandfather, who was the president of Marin-Dell, was tragically killed in a barn collapse in 1937. You can see a tribute there that appears in the Marin-Dell binders, a tribute by Dean Maddox, Buddha, that he read on his radio show. But for the members of the Silvera family, we wouldn't have these binders. We're not quite sure really who put these binders together. It was a tremendous amount of work, and we don't even know how many of the binders were created. This is just an example of one page of the binder entries, or one entry from the binders, 3 pages. Each of the entries, or almost every one of the entries, had this format. It starts with one page with 6 photos, and these are original photos of the individual dairy and in some of its operations. And note the hand lettering that appears in the binders identifying the dairy. Then it was followed by at least 1 or 2 pages of text, in some cases, as we'll see more. The text identifies the dairy, shows the producer number for the dairy operator, the location of the dairy, a general description of where it's located or was located, a little bit about the infrastructure, the size, and so forth, and then gets into, from my perspective, the most interesting part. Talks about the history of the family that was operating the dairy, both or usually at least 2 generations, including quite a bit of detail about where the first generation came from. It then talks about the acreage of the farm, the number of the herd, both milk cows and other cattle, and also a little bit about the history of their relationship with Marin-Dell, and then ends with some salutatory and complimentary comments. So this shows the number of pages and the number of dairies that had those page numbers. So for 5 of the dairies, there were no, or for the entries, there were no page numbers, but or no contents, or because those were usually handled. The comments would have been handled in the entries for some relative or related dairy. But most of the dairies had 2 or 3 pages of contents. You can see a few of them had more, and in some cases there were quite a few more. And those tended to be cases where there were somewhat complicated dairy histories, obviously families that had had a longer relationship with Marin-Dell, and also histories of Switzerland and the Azores were included as well. So where were these dairies in 1950? And remember that this is a snapshot of the dairies that were supplying Marin-Dell as of 1950. There were likely many other dairies that supplied Marin-Dell prior to 1950 that aren't shown on this map. But in any case, you can see the red icons show the dairies that were located in Marin County, and then the green icons show dairies in primarily Sonoma, and then one in Napa County. So there were 38 dairies in Marin, 24 in Sonoma and Napa. The Google map that I use doesn't show the names of the dairies associated with the individual icons, so I prepared these additional maps to annotate the dairy names onto the icons so you can see where they all were. The typical progression for these dairy farmers that came from to Marin to work on our dairies, often they would just start, they would have relatively limited means, and they would start on a dairy as an employee, as a milker. They might move from dairy to dairy over the years and then make some money, save some money, possibly buy a few cattle, and then they might then become a partner on a dairy with their cattle, still, however, just leasing space. So they would own the cattle, but not much else in terms of assets. They might then become a lead partner, would have a few more cattle, take the lead in a partnership, operating a dairy, perhaps still leasing the property. Ultimately, they might be able to purchase the property, and then they would become the owner of the land and the buildings. They might continue to operate the dairy, but in many cases, at that point, they would just become a lessor to other dairy operators who would be leasing the property. This was just one example of one of the dairy families, the Fagundes family that is covered in the Marin-Dell binders. This was Manuel Fagundes, the father of Joseph Fagundes, and these were the dairies at which Manuel worked in the period that he was in Marin County before he was ultimately able to acquire his own dairy and purchase land up in the Lucas Valley, Marinwood area. As I said, the Marin-Dell binders included a lot of detail about where the individuals came from. All of them came from Europe. This chart shows a bit more of a breakdown. You can see 43% came from Portugal, the Azores and Madeira, of 23% from Switzerland, primarily the canton of Ticino, 19% from Italy, most of those from the province of Lombardy, but a few from Liguria and Tuscany, and then 4 other European countries. For the Azores, it's always interesting for me to note what a large percentage of immigrants to Marin came from the one island of São Jorge, which is that long, skinny island that you can see there. We're not quite sure why that concentration occurred here in Marin, but it certainly, we've seen it here in the Sausalito area in our research, and also it is also seen in terms of the origins of the Marin-Dell farmers. Here's a map showing the location of Ticino. one of the Italian-speaking cantons in Switzerland along the Italian border. You can see how it just sort of fits in there to the Italian provinces of Piedmont and Lombardy. This map shows just how the families that came both from Ticino and those that came from across the border in the Italian province of Lombardy, the green ones, they really, although they were from two different countries, they really weren't very far apart. I guess why we refer to them as primarily Swiss Italians here in our history. You can see the blue dotted line. That's a circle with a 45-mile diameter. So they were certainly quite close as far as the crow flies. But this was a very mountainous part of Switzerland and Italy, and so it was quite difficult for people to get around there, and so there would not have been much exchange between those areas. This is a set of maps that shows Marin County, the island of São Jorge, and the canton of Ticino. And they're all at the same scale, so you can get a rough idea of how distances compared in the three locations. In Ticino, I've added the three major rivers, the Maggia, the Verzanska, and the Ticino rivers. Those were the river valleys that the most of the families that came to Marin from that area came from, and almost all of them came from that area within that dotted rectangle. Many of these immigrants didn't speak much English, but they certainly would have had a lot of experience with cows in both Switzerland and the Azores. And as I say, they didn't speak English, but they know their way around cows. These are just some photos from the two locations. This chart shows the information about the number of milk cows that the individual Marin-Dell dairies had. This would have been in 1950 when the binders were prepared. There was quite a range in numbers. The average was 128 milk cows, and milk cows because they also had other livestock that were on their premises, but these was the count of the cows that were actually producing milk in 1950. I have a note there that these numbers are a bit skewed because there were 12 dairies, including some of the largest, that didn't report production figures. This is another chart that shows the number of 10-gallon cans of milk produced by the dairies daily at their peak production. Again, the 12 dairies are omitted from those figures. This is a chart that shows the duration of the relationship that the various dairies that were in the 1950 binder had with Marin-Dell. As you can see, 8 of them went all the way back to the very beginning in 1930. Those were the Barboni family's dairies, the Corda brothers' dairies, the Cunha dairy, the Manuel Pimentel dairy, and the Tony Silveira dairy. But you can see that there many more came on much more recently. During the war, there was one of the interesting things that happened was there was a relaxation of the grade A, grade B requirements, such that grade B dairies could supply milk for human consumption. After the war, a number of the dairies that had been grade B dairies upgraded, made the investments to upgrade their facilities to qualify as grade A dairies, And so at that point, they too were able to become suppliers to Marin-Dell. So you might ask, were there many family relationships among the dairy operators? Here are the tables of contents for the two binders. Well, yes, there were. I won't even go into trying to explain these relationships, but allow it to say that there were many, many relationships between these dairy operators. Some of these are identified in the Marin-Dell binders, but others I've been able to identify just by a little bit of genealogical research, and I'm sure that I've only scratched the surface here. The Marin-Dell binders had some really amazing photographs in them on a whole variety of subjects. This set here was taken for just showing some of their trucks and equipment. The one photo that isn't in the binder is the one in the center there, showing Manuel Mendez standing in front of his truck. He was a long-time Marin-Dell driver, and his daughter, Diane Mendez Rep, had shared with me that photo of her dad in front of his truck. There were many barns, of course, and there were lots of barn pictures in the binders, usually one for every one of the dairies. These are just some of my favorites. Up at the top left there is the dairy, or the barn for what was called the Marin Cattle Company dairy that was out in Point Reyes in Gerbaud Valley. Nothing is there today. That was acquired by the Park Service, and all of that dairy was torn down. At the upper right was what's called the Alto Dairy. That was the Mendoza Dairy. Earlier, that had been the Rockmaraish Dairy. You can see the railroad line running right by the dairy. That is at Mill Valley, just behind where Whole Foods and CVS are along Blythedale today. At the center left was the dairy that was on the McNear property, operated by Domingos Pacheco. That dairy was unique in that it was built completely of brick, since the McNear Brickyard was nearby, and that was a ready source of building materials. And then at the center right, the Golden Gate Dairy, just across from Muir Beach. That is still standing today as an equestrian center, but that barn is still very recognizable. There are lots of cow pictures in the Marin-Dell binders, probably more than anybody would really want to see, but obviously the cows were the center of attention. These are another couple of photos were taken that are in the binders that allow you to get kind of a now or a then and now comparison. Can you identify the location of this photo? Well, this was taken at the John Cunha Dairy in Mill Valley, which was, those cows are up on the hillside there, looking down on the intersection of Blythedale, East Blythedale, Tiburon Boulevard, and Highway 101. And at the lower right, you can see roughly the same view today. Obviously, the Cloverleaf overpass and so forth has gone in since the picture was taken in 1950. Here's another mystery location. What do you think? Well, if you guessed Highway 101 just south of Lucas Valley Road, you were correct. That was the Fagundes Dairy, and today the YMCA building, the white building in the lower right or lower center there, is on that site. I wanted to thank everybody who has helped me on this project. It has certainly been a great deal of fun for me. I had the opportunity to meet several people that I hadn't known before, including Woody Korda, the grandson of Fred Korda. And Woody was about to celebrate his 80th birthday and invited me to attend. So I got a chance to go and celebrate with Woody and just a few of his closest friends and family at the old Korda barn, which is on Hicks Valley Road. And you can see the barn there is marked with the star on the page, the 80 Korda page from the Marin-Dell binders. Most of my work in the past has involved the Portuguese community. This was a great opportunity to meet folks who were of Swiss and Swiss-Italian heritage, and I had the chance to attend the 78th annual Sonoma Marin Swiss Club picnic in Pengrove just earlier this month. A lot of fun. These show some of the earlier talks I've given that might be of interest. My talk before the Mill Valley Historical Society involving Southern Marin's Portuguese roots, and the talk I referenced earlier for the Marin History Museum about Marin's dairy history. You can scan the QR codes directly from your computer screen, and those will take you to YouTube presentations I made, the recordings of those. And then in the center QR code there will take you to a list of resources that I prepared in connection with my talk at Mill Valley. I hope you will find those of some interest. Thank you very much for your interest in this topic and my presentation. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions, or particularly if you have information about the Portuguese community or dairy history here in Marin County. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much.